Hey, Andrea, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I am very excited to have you on today. Now, we've talked several times on the phone, and you definitely know what's up in FemTech. So excited to get your opinion on the record today.
Well, it's a privilege for me to be here. Thank you.
It is my privilege. It is. Well, our listeners love to hear more about the guest's background because we normally don't, say in kindergarten, we want to work in FemTech. And so tell us a little bit more about your personal story. Where are you from? What did you study? And how did you end up here?
So I have more than one job. I'm a chief medical officer for a company, Health Decisions, a clinical research organization focused on women's health. A CRO or clinical research organization provides support for pharmaceutical companies or diagnostic companies to help run clinical trials. Health Decisions is unique in that we only focus on women's health. I am an OBGYN. I've worked for over 25 years in the clinic and research. I trained at both Duke and UNC. After my training, I worked at Duke as an attending. In medical school, I got 2 degrees. I got an MD and master's in biostatistics. So I'm a little nerdy, as you are, given you're a geneticist. After being in academics for 10 years, I kind of wanted more autonomy. I had a small family, so I formed a clinical research company and GYN clinic. And then after I had a private practice, Health Decisions approached me, and I've been with them for 3 years.
Wow, you have had so many hats that you have worn. So many hats. So did you know, like right from college, that you wanted to be a medical doctor? And did you know you wanted to be an OB-GYN?
I didn't know I wanted to be an OB-GYN, but my father was a doctor. So I'm a little corny. My dad kind of considered it a privilege to be a physician, and I feel the same way. I feel like it's a privilege to take care of women.
Yeah. Did you grow up in the North Carolina area?
I did. I grew up in Asheville, so in the mountains.
I've heard of Asheville. Many people told me I'm going to like it there. So yes. I heard it's pretty cool.
It is. It's awesome.
So you go to med school, you're gonna go into women's health, and I always find it fascinating when I meet MDs that then also do research. So what were some of the research questions that you were investigating?
So at Duke, you have to do a year of research. It's built into the curriculum. And I was drawn in infectious disease, actually. I studied with a world-renowned infectious disease man, David Durack, and co-authored a paper on a condition called endocarditis, and built a database that led to kind of the Duke criteria for endocarditis, which is one of the reasons why I studied biostatistics.
Wow. And endocarditis, I do not know what that is actually. What is that?
Infective endocarditis, it's an infection in the heart valve.
Okay. Got it. Interesting. Wow. Really, you have been around the human body, all the different things, heart valves, uteruses, all the things. Wow. And then I am really excited to talk to you today about your experience in clinical trials. So when was the first time you've ever worked in a clinical trial setting?
In residency. So I was at Duke Medical School, then did residency at UNC, and worked with John Thorpe, who is still at UNC, doing research with fetal fibronectin, which is still available today, and preterm labor. And he was the principal investigator, but I did some statistical analysis for him.
What is fetal fibronectin?
I
promise everyone I am smart, but there's so much left to know in the world, so I'm gonna try my best to pronounce these things.
It's a protein that can be released in preterm labor that can help predict if a woman is gonna deliver early or not.
Whoa. Okay, so what was your clinical trial like? Was your clinical trial like showing that that was the case, or were you like trying to do something else with that phenomenon?
I looked at the database that they prospectively collected and showed that if you did an exam, that could show that it was falsely positive. So you shouldn't do an exam before you collected data to show that it was positive or negative.
Interesting. And you know, I know for myself, you know, I was a researcher, geneticist in the laboratory, and I love science. I really do. But I felt like the things I was working on may not actually help people for 20 years, if ever, right? Like hopefully somebody somewhere finds my paper and they connect it to something else and it cures cancer. I don't know, right? Did you feel like when you were working in a clinical trial that you had like a faster impact on people's lives, or you know, was there something that drew you to that more than having like a private practice at that point?
I think it just inspired me to continue doing clinical research. So then soon after I finished my residency, I went to Duke, and I just enjoyed the science aspect of it. And I got to work with an individual, Andrea James at Duke, and then we formalized a women's hemostasis and thrombosis clinic, and I started becoming an expert in heavy menstrual bleeding. Okay. So women that have bleeding disorders have heavy menstrual bleeding, and women that have clotting disorders are often on anticoagulation medications and have heavy menstrual bleeding. So I started learning a lot about the menstrual blood loss and medications that can control blood loss.
Wow. So is this like a big issue that we don't know about? That's usually the theme of the show, is like, this is a giant issue. Millions of women are suffering and like, we've never heard about it. So what about this, the like heavy blood loss and heavy menstruation? Is that like a really big issue for women?
Very much so. It impacts 25-30% of women worldwide, and there are few remedies. There are many devices that can be used to treat heavy menstrual bleeding. There are several medications that have recently been approved for the condition as well.
Would one of the solutions be to take a birth control that stops you from having a period? Is that something you'd recommend?
Yes, many birth control pills can be used for the condition.
Yeah. What kind of devices? Are you talking about IUDs?
Yes, some IUDs, for instance, like the Mirena, is one of the few IUDs that's approved for the treatment of heavy menstrual bleeding that want to use intrauterine contraception.
Interesting. How does a woman know if she has heavy menstrual bleeding versus average? Because I feel like I don't necessarily talk about like the volume of my menstrual blood with pretty much anyone. So how does a woman know if she's average or above average?
I know, that's a great question. Some women don't know because their mom might have had the same problem, and they learn from their mom and they don't know. I one time had a woman referred to me because she was very anemic, and I walk in and she's asleep, you know, and I kind of awaken her.
Oh my God.
And she didn't think she had heavy menstrual bleeding, but you know, she's like, yeah, I can fall asleep at any time. And I kind of chuckled and I said, that's because you're so anemic, and it's your body's way of resting.
Wow.
There are ways to know. There's a normally a period lasts only 4 days, you know, but for clinical trials, there's an objective way in which you measure menstrual blood loss.
Oh, really?
And yep, you either there's standard pads and tampons, and at my clinical research center, we actually give women sanitary products, and they have to take them home, use them, and then there's a standard bag and collection that they have to do. Then they bring them back, and we send it to a lab.
Yeah.
And they have to, then it's quantified, and there's an actual number that comes back. So normally you only have 40 milliliters of blood in an entire period. And if it's more than 80, that's objectively heavy menstrual bleeding.
Got it. Wow. All right. I'm getting this now. I'm like, and I also know 40 milliliters from the laboratory, so I can actually start to visualize that volume.
Yeah. Which is actually low volume. So if you think about that, a lot of the menstrual period is not actual blood. It's transudate or proteins or other material.
And that's what fills up the 40 mils, or the 40 mils is the actual blood and there's other like volume of other stuff?
Yeah, 40 milliliters is actual blood.
Okay.
So there's other stuff.
Other stuff, yeah. Interesting. Well, we have a lot of different types of listeners. We have my friends up in New Hampshire that are farmers. We have people from Israel and all over, like all different backgrounds. So I don't want to assume anyone obviously knows what a clinical trial is or why one would need it. So can you please break down for us, like what, kind of product requires a clinical trial and why?
Sure. You want me to use a device?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's look at a device. Like I'm going to present this fall on a device called the Sonata. That is a device that treats fibroids via the vagina and cervix. And there's a device that goes in the cavity that then uses radio frequency energy to ablate the fibroid.
Whoa.
So it's for women that have heavy menstrual bleeding, and it ablates a fibroid. So the first thing you do in a clinical trial is you give a woman a consent form that outlines everything involved in a clinical study, and it's on a reading level of a sixth grader, so it's easy to understand. She is given time to read that thoroughly, understand what's involved, and she signs it. Then there's often blood work. You might do a pap smear, an ultrasound, if it's for heavy menstrual bleeding and fibroids, to make sure she has a type of fibroid that would qualify. Then she might be brought back. Additional testing is done. For instance, in that case, an endometrial biopsy is done to make sure the lining of the uterus is normal. If she meets all the inclusion and exclusion criteria that's been predefined, then she would undergo the procedure. And then this study in particular was over 3 years.
Wow.
So it's looked at how much her bleeding improved.
Wow, over 3 years. And, we're hearing a lot now during the time of COVID and trying to get this vaccine about, what phase of clinical trial the vaccine is in. So can you tell us about how many phases there are and what's the difference?
Absolutely. So the Sonata trial was a phase 3 study. So there are 4 phases. Phase one is done in healthy volunteers. So they're just looking at how the medication, or usually let's talk medication, how it might impact titers, what side effects there might be. It's not in the disease of interest. It's in a healthy volunteer. Phase 2, it's usually going to be in the disease of interest. And they're going to look at a range of doses perhaps, and again, side effects and safety. And then phase 3, it tends to be the disease of interest. They probably know the dose, and it's going to be a large scale, and it's going to tend to be how they think that medication will be used. and it'll likely reflect the label of the drug. And then phase 4 is when a medication has already been approved, and they might be looking at some other, perhaps some other way in which it might be used.
Wow. So on average and this might be different for medicine versus device, I don't know, but tell me, how long does this usually take to get through all 3 clinical trials so that it can get to market? How long does that take?
So many years. So I've worked with a company, I'll use a real company, AbbVie. They have a drug, which is a remarkable drug that's been approved for both endometriosis and uterine fibroids, called Orilissa and Orion. And I got to do their phase 1 studies, which was 10 years ago.
Oh my gosh. Is it available yet to women?
Yeah, yes.
Okay.
So it's called Orilissa for endometriosis and Orion for heavy menstrual bleeding associated with fibroids.
And so is it like a 5-year thing to get through all these trials? Is it 8 years? Or
10 for 10. Fibroids, a little less for and they went for endometriosis first, and I think it's been on the market for about 2 years for endometriosis.
Wow. Is this average for like all countries, or is this like the US average?
I think it's tougher in the US.
Yeah, interesting.
But sometimes a drug can be kind of have an accelerated path. I did a lot with a company for a drug called Lysteta, which is a drug for heavy menstrual bleeding. Okay. It had been around worldwide for a long time, and that was approved in probably, I think it took maybe 4 or 5 years. So it was quicker.
Wow, that's the fast pace. This is 4 or 5 years. Wow.
Yeah. But now the vaccines for COVID, that will be more accelerated.
Yes, of course. I mean, the whole world is trying to do it, right? You're combining forces. So, how much does that cost on average, you think, to do a 10-year study? People got to get paid. Things got to get made. Like, how much is this costing people?
I don't even want to. I'd have to get back to you on that one. More than I can imagine.
Yeah. Well, we are on the FemTech Focus podcast, and I think all of this is incredibly relevant to us, and you keep name dropping all of these drugs and devices for women, which is awesome. You obviously have your finger on the pulse, but what I'm curious about is some of the information that I may not be able to find on the internet that you might know because you're in the trenches. What's your experience been like in specifically trying to get women's medication or women's medical devices to market? Do you notice that there's like some barriers that we have that, erectile dysfunction drug doesn't have, or a, heart valve med device doesn't have? Like, is there anything that we should know that's kind of unique to women's health devices getting approved?
Well, I do think it's, historically, it's always been harder, and women have not been included in the clinical trials until more recently.
Wow.
I think it was 1993 that the NIH passed what's called a Revitalization Act, and that was when they kind of established guidelines that women and minorities needed to be included in clinical trials, and
Wow.
That's a little, that's 30 years ago. And prior to that, it was mostly men that were included in clinical trials. So it's still a little bit slanted towards men.
Yeah, we're essentially, so the result of that is that medications and devices are kind of tweaked for a white male's health, and then we're just assuming it's going to fit for not white and not male people as well, but usually doesn't always, just translate easily like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, but I think, at Health Decisions, we're only focused on women's health, and for instance, we have been the coordinating center for the Contraceptive Clinical Trial Network, and I think that's kind of the leading network for contraception. So that's been phenomenal. We're working on contraceptive gels that men can use. Nothing's been approved yet, but that's been phenomenal.
Yeah.
Clint Dart is the principal investigator for that for Health Decisions. Sarah Godfrey is the program director, so that's been wonderful. We're working with a company that's led by women for gels for sexual arousal. So that's another area that I think hasn't been as wonderful for women as it has been for men. Yeah. And you know, you and I have talked before. That's not my dog. I want to go on record for saying that. So
sorry.
That's okay.
He's very upset that sexual wellness is not being innovated.
Is that it? But there are companies that are leading the way. You know, there's a gel that can increase blood flow to genital tissue that's being developed for female sexual arousal disorder, which will be wonderful if approved. It'll likely improve the arousal of women that don't even have arousal disorder. So that'll be wonderful.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
But for instance, one of the medications like Addie that was approved, you know, initially there was truly a contraindication that a woman could not drink and take that medication. And in the approval of that drug, you know, this didn't happen to men. They had women drink large amounts of alcohol and take the medication. And then women felt woozy. And
what?
So that, you know, yeah, they had as part of the approval process, they made women take large amounts of alcohol and the medication, and they felt woozy. So subsequently, they've taken the contraindication away and just made it a black box warning. So it's frustrating. It's frustrating to see the discrepancy in some of the medications for women versus men.
Yes. And what I've heard, and tell me if this is true, maybe it's just rumor, just gossip, right? That the FDA requires like new medicine or new devices for women to be extremely, you know, better than what's on the market. And if it's not, if it's just like on par with what's on the market, then the FDA isn't as inclined to approve of it compared to devices or drugs for men. Do you notice that too? Like, is it harder to convince the FDA to approve of women's devices?
I don't know if that's true. And I'm probably most familiar with like endometrial ablation devices. So women, in terms of heavy menstrual bleeding, there are devices that can ablate or destroy the lining of the uterus. And I was involved with a study by AGEA, which is approved, which uses a water vapor in the cavity, and it had very good success. And there are a number of endometrial ablation devices available. Okay. So I don't know that that's true.
All right, got it. And what about like codes to get it approved for insurance reimbursement? Because I know there's some issues with insurance not seeing women's sexual wellness as a medical issue, right? And so if you're spending $500 million in 10 years to create the sexual wellness lotion for women, but in the end of the day, there's no code to bill it to insurance, like investors may not invest in that because the business model is kind of broken up. What's your experience been around that? Do you see that sexual wellness isn't necessarily approved as often for insurance? And what about other diseases?
Well, insurance companies are always a challenge. So that might be beyond the scope of my knowledge too. I mean, that is something I'm constantly learning as a provider and coding. So yeah, that's an ongoing issue for insurance companies.
Have you ever had to go down the route of like petitioning for a new code to be made so that your device or drug was could be billed?
No, but I know of experts that do that for a living, but I've never.
Wow, like their whole job is to do that.
Yes.
Whoa. Yeah, because I feel like we're still learning so much more about the women's health. And so like I wouldn't be surprised if we were still discovering new disorders, or we're realizing that something we kind of categorized as, I don't know, endometriosis, but turns out there's actually two types, right? And so like they may need to be billed differently. And so that's interesting. There's people's, their whole job is to kind of code that stuff.
Yes.
Wow. What are some of the exciting things you're working on right now at Health Decisions, in terms of, you know, certain illnesses that you're working on for women?
Well, so I mentioned the Contraceptive Network. So
Mhm.
all of those clinical studies. I mentioned um, the gel to increase flow to the genital tissue. We're working on diagnostics for colon cancer, diagnostics for the flu, um, bacterial vaginosis treatment. We have a clinical trial with infertility group, a number of different things. So that
Wow.
is exciting.
Wow, very diverse. So interesting. Um, well, what do you see as the future of, you know, clinical trials for women's health? Do you think that it's, you know, being taken care of, or is there still lots of opportunity for people to, you know, get into this business of clinical trials for women?
I think it's only getting better
Mm.
for women's health. I think there's a lot of opportunities, in particular for fibroids and endometriosis and contraception and migraines. I think there are a lot of companies that have focused on women's health. There's always room for improvement. And as I was thinking about talking with you today, I thought of someone I had met, Lynn Seeley, who had not yet formed a company, but she's the CEO at a company, Myovant, that's looking at a product for both endometriosis and heavy menstrual bleeding associated with fibroids. And it's not through Health Decisions, but I'm working with their company at my research center. And they have kind of partnered with a company that has an app called Flow, which tracks menstrual bleeding.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the most common one. I mean, when I see women, there are a lot of apps that can track menstrual bleeding, but that does seem to be the most popular one. So it's exciting to see. I'm doing research with this company, and they've partnered. It's not the one used in the clinical trials, but they're forward thinking in the fact that they're impacting and using or developing a drug that will lessen a woman's menstrual flow. And they've partnered with a very popular app in which women are already using it to track their periods.
Yeah, you know, I see the future of healthcare as really combining the consumer taking control of their health by having at home like apps or devices, with the help of their, you know, physician that they may only get to see for a few minutes at a time every few weeks. But when you combine those forces, I feel like our health can be exponentially improved when you're empowering that consumer as well. And these apps could potentially be one of those ways, right?
Exactly. I agree.
Yeah. Well, you know, we have a lot of aspiring entrepreneurs that listen to this podcast, and they are chomping at the bit to figure out what should they be working on, what needs innovating, right? Because they don't want to reinvent something that's already solved. So what's an area in women's health and wellness that you think still needs innovating?
That's a good question. I still think sexual health. I mean, I think that's a huge one that isn't addressed adequately. Um, I think migraines. I think weight loss. I think anxiety and depression.
Those are all really good. I actually want to dive into them a little bit. So when you say sexual health, are you talking about like have women orgasm better, or are you talking about like comfortable sex or sex after menopause?
I'm going to say all of it. I think women still, I think still women have difficulty. Even so, I mean, some women don't. Some women, come in and talk about everything. But I think that's the minority. I think a lot of women have trouble talking about it, even with a provider. I often have to bring it up with women. It's not often that women come to me and bring it up themselves. And it's hard to get a woman comfortable talking about it. And even the providers within my practice, so not everyone's comfortable bringing it up. And it's an important area that I think can benefit a woman's life if it's positive.
Yeah. So what I hear from you is that we're kind of at like level 1 of we need to start having a community discussion about sexual wellness before we're even like, talking about what solutions need to exist. And then I really loved what I'm interested to hear, why did you say migraines, weight loss, and anxiety? Do those affect women differently or disproportionately than men?
They do. Well, now weight, migraines do, depression does. Weight, to be honest with you, I'm not sure about that.
Okay. Yeah.
Off the top of my head. I mean, I see women, 2/3 of the American population is overweight.
Is it true, or it's a myth that it's harder for women to lose weight compared to men?
Well, given I see only women, I'm gonna say it's true.
Yeah. Sometimes, on this show, I have brought up several myths, and the guest is like, "Yeah, that's not true. Like, that's an old wives' tale." So sometimes I ask, I'm like, "I don't know. This is what I've been walking around thinking." So, all right. But migraines affecting women differently, or disproportionately, do we know any like science behind that? Like why women have more migraines than men do? Or we're just like, interesting.
No, I'm sure it probably is known why, but I don't know why. But I bet you we do know why.
Wow. Well, listeners, again, FemTech is not just periods and, breasts and uteruses. It is also things that disproportionately or differently affect women. So migraines and anxiety, super interesting. And, our last question for you is, what do you think the femtech industry as a whole right now needs the most right now in order to be successful? Like where we're at, what do you think we need in order to keep moving forward?
Well, I still think probably more awareness.
Yeah.
Thankfully Danielle was the one who highlighted your wonderful podcast to me. So I am going to be more of a promoter of you and FemTech. But I don't think there's enough awareness of FemTech. Yeah. So anything I can do moving forward to help you, I want you to let me know.
Thank you. Oh my goodness. Well, we're nothing without our guests. So my listeners know I'm pretty much learning on the fly with y'all. So it's all because of your thought leadership. And especially you've been in the trenches for a long time. You've brought a lot of devices and drugs to market and have literally touched millions of women's lives and improved them. So thank you so much for the work you've done.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Well, this has been such an amazing conversation, and I thank you so much for your time today. You are a busy woman, and I'm glad we were able to snag some minutes with you.
Sure. Thank you, Brittany.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.